My name is Ellie Gold. I'm the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy, and I thank you all for joining us today for a brief briefing on what's currently happening in Iran, the situation here. Today we have with us Brigadier General Ernie Adino and Matt Brodsky, both senior fellows at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Since the change in administrations, the dynamics with our relationship with Iran and the dynamics within Iranian leadership have changed. Their attitude towards the United States, towards our interests, have significantly changed as well. So I thought that it was an opportunity to have a discussion. It's very brief, just to give a sense as to what's going on. It's still early in the game right now, and I think that over the next few weeks, months, we'll see a great shift in really how this is going to play out. But one thing that was quite telling to me was that somebody who I asked to join us on this call, who has participated over the years with discussions relating to Iran and the general region, asked to or recused himself from this discussion because as he described it, about 15 people a day in the region are assassinated by Iran for speaking out. And for those reasons, he asked that he be excused from participating today. Now, for me, when I thought that this was an important conversation to be had, when he gave me that response to the invitation, that told me just how important it is for us to have this conversation. The dynamics, as I said before, in Tehran during a Trump administration was far different than what it is in the first month of the Biden administration. For that reason, I thought it was important, and let me move to our first speaker, Matt Brodsky. Matt is a Middle East expert and geopolitical analyst. He has briefed members of Congress, the State Department, Department of Defense, Special Operations Command, and the National Security Council. Matt has published numerous scholarly journals, international and national newspaper editorials, magazine features, and wrote a chapter on Syria in the AFPC's World Almanac on Islam. He is a frequent contributor to a variety of publications, radio and television, both here and throughout the Middle East, a specialist on Mideast affairs and Arab politics, with a degree in Mideast history from Tel Aviv University. Matt, the floor is yours.
Well, hey, thank you for hosting this, and certainly a lot of developments on the Iran front, especially when it comes to the theaters in which it's involved. Part of that is Iraq. We should bear in mind that all of the pressure campaign that we're seeing is under the umbrella of the type of pressure that Iran now feels emboldened to put on the Biden administration, which it views that it can use this pressure to get the U.S. back into the JCPOA, specifically to get the United States to end a lot of its sanctions and to flush the regime with cash. So we see this type of pressure campaign militarily being resumed inside of Iraq. That's something that was to a large extent put on pause for a while. If you recall, just to back up here, we've recently seen, of course, the attack in Iraq by Shia militias on areas next to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and of course in the Kurdish region in Erbil. It was these kind of attacks that led the Trump administration to assassinate Qasem Soleimani and Mohandes, the IRGC Quds Force commander. That kind of put a pause on what Iran was willing to do to Iraq. Now, there were, of course, still some type of missile attacks in that, but the message that the previous administration was sending was that if you attack us, we will strike back, and strike back with whatever proportion we choose. That was an important message. Our messaging right now is a bit confused, which I'll get into in a second. I think a lot of people tend to get lost in the West on ascribing blame to whichever specific militia it is. It's kind of like the IRGC creates a lot of front organizations to avoid sanctions inside of Iran. In much the same way, Shia militias, which are pretty much all beholden to Iran, will create a splinter group and then slap a new title on it. If they're sanctioned, then hopefully they won't be sanctioned, or will confuse the response. And according to our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, their comments afterwards have really indicated that we're going to hold those responsible, which is your standard line, and at the same time said that we'll have to find out who is responsible, which anyone who the type of events is quite clear on who is responsible for this. Incidentally, just one of the avenues one could look at is the fact that scores of 107 millimeter rockets were used. These are the exact type of rockets that have been used in the past. I'd say since May 2019, actually, Iran-backed militias have been behind about 83 such attacks on U.S. positions. So this is a long-going pattern. The February 15th rocket attack on the Erbil International Airport was a second strike on the city, and the fourth major rocket attack on coalition facilities in Iraq since September 2020. Now, again, this is just one pressure point for Iran. One of the, I would call it an unforced error, was the Biden administration immediately delisted the Houthis as a terrorist organization. So we've already made concessions in Yemen as well. And the response that we've seen from the administration so far, I would say, leaves a lot to be desired. Biden and the Iraqi prime minister spoke on the phone on Tuesday and said that, those who are determined to be responsible, quote, must be fully held to account, which is what you would expect. But the reality has been that Iran is able to attack the United States where it chooses, and that's something that remains to be the case. It does so fairly with impunity, and it's making the gamble. Iran is gambling that the United States is going to essentially cave in on its demands. A part of this has to do with the fact that both Democrats and Republicans, to a large extent, have said that they wanted to further withdraw American troops from the Middle East. President Trump, as you recall, pretty much halved our troop presence from 5,000 to 2,500 inside of Iraq. And Iran was really hoping to get rid of us. But what we see overall, I would say, in the administration's approach, and I can get into during Q&A, issues regarding what the IAEA has currently been saying and some of the other nuclear file developments as to what we're learning about that. But what's becoming very clear is that the Biden administration right now does not actually have really an Iran policy. What it has is a JCPOA, or Iran deal policy, which in the end ends up meaning that what we are likely to see is a strategic realignment policy, much like the Obama administration had, which would be, a very poor decision for the United States and, of course, all of our regional allies. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that. We're going to move to Ernie Adino here. Give me 1 minute, please. Okay. So many of you know Ernie already from a recent briefing that we've had. But for those who don't, Brigadier General Ernie Adino, U.S. Army retired, currently serves as a senior advisor to Kurdistan National Assembly of Syria. General Adino graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1983 and retired in 2011 after a 28-year Army career. He's served multiple assignments in armor, cavalry, infantry, and striker units. Other key assignments included service as the Army Congressional Fellow in the U.S. Senate, duty as executive assistant to the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of Nuclear Support at the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency. His last assignment was as a Deputy Director of Operations for Headquarters of the U.S. Army in the Pentagon. He considers his most significant assignment to be his service in Iraq, where he commanded a team of combat advisors embedded in the 3rd Infantry Brigade, 4th Division Iraqi Army. His brigade was formed entirely of Kurdish Peshmerga, remissioned to conduct counterinsurgency operations. Ernie and I have been working for quite some time now on matters relating to Iraq, to Kurdistan, and the region. So with that, I'm pleased to give you the floor, Ernie, General.
Thanks, Ellie. Good to see some old friends on the call today. John Wolstetter, good morning. I hope all's well. Briefly, so my time in Kurdistan, I'll just say as far as I know, I'm still the only U.S. officer to develop a concentration at the National War College in Kurdish history and Islam. And lo and behold, the Army embedded me with the Kurdish fighters. And as I like to say, that's against all Army logic. They should have sent me to Korea. It begins with this same first letter. So, this is either, my assignment there is either the result of pure dumb luck or direct evidence of the divine hand. So anyhow, it was my most meaningful assignment. Yeah, so let's talk Iran. Beating Iran matters. And the reality is, whether this administration wants to acknowledge this or not, Iran is on the strategic offensive. Now, we can pretend otherwise, and if we do, we lose. We recognize this, and we can prevail. And that's going to require breaking Tehran's will to fight. And this fight is really, in the 21st century, sure, it may very well involve some kinetic activity, some kinetic operations, but it's more than just the application of lethal force. In fact, Tehran has been polishing its indirect approach through proxies, through co-opting regions and countries in the area that are of significance to it via other means. And all of these means are calculated to occur at thresholds below which they attract any real Western and in particular U.S. interest, and certainly below levels that they calculate would otherwise inspire a decisive U.S. response. And so meanwhile, while we look the other way, Iran continues to consolidate its hold across its Shia crescent all the way to the Mediterranean. But before we get any deeper in this, on strategic levels, it's always useful to begin with a discussion of vital national interest. And as I like to say, sound strategy begins at the end, the place where self-interest, where national interest is served. So if we're sitting in Tehran, what are those vital national interests that they are either trying to secure, promote, or both. And I'd say that, number one, and Iran has been quite successful with this, displace the United States from our vital interests in the region. Two, project Iranian and, by the way, Russian power into the Eastern Mediterranean. Three, to strangle global energy and via that the economy. Four, religiously or ethnically cleanse anyone not Shia or Persian. And the last, to destroy our great ally, Israel. We can pretend otherwise, but that's the reality, and the Iranians have been committed to that. All right, for the first time since the time of the Persian Empire, 400 BC, Iran now has meaningful military presence on the Mediterranean. When the Obama administration pulled out all U.S. combat troops from Iraq in December 2011 was the last of them, Tehran emerged as the dominant power in the Gulf, period, exclamation point. And it is moving with reckless abandon to consolidate on the Mediterranean, all the way up, all the way across Iraq, all the way across to Syria, to the shores of the Mediterranean, and to their Hezbollah allies in Lebanon. And they've done it, and they will continue to expand that footprint. So at this point, they are on the Mediterranean, and the Russians are on the Mediterranean. And I assert that the Mediterranean is of even more strategic significance than it was in the days after World War II, when we rushed through the Marshall Plan to commit substantial combat power and other resources to defend it and secure it until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, we've got a Mediterranean that, well, hosts some very important strategic level fiber optic cables across the seabed. They didn't exist during the days of World War II. We've got the greatest destabilizing migrant flows in history across the Mediterranean and into Central Europe. And in the days of World War II, to put this in context, we saw the security and the stability of Central Europe as being an essential condition to continued US national security. Now we've got the greatest destabilizing migrant flows, and those flows are being throttled by levers in Tehran, in Damascus, and yes, I'll be honest, Ankara, and Russia is part of that calculus. Okay, so the Mediterranean now also has the largest discoveries of natural gas in history, or at least in the 21st century. The Leviathan field off the coast of Israel, the even larger Zohr field off the coast of Egypt, the Aphrodite field off the coast of Cyprus. And the combined value of those reserves is 122 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. But the beauty is it's in proximity, close enough to Central Europe to suggest a strong potential to help relieve the EU of its critical dependency on Russian energy. So if Washington wants stiffer spines in Brussels and lighter wallets in Moscow, then we have to help the Europeans cut these energy tethers to Russia, Tehran's strategic ally. So let's take this one step further. To explain what what certainly is at risk here. We have critical dependencies in the European Union. Brussels imports about 30% of its annual energy from Moscow, from Russia. We've got Germany, another 30%, Turkey imports 35% of its oil, 60% of its natural gas from Russian sources. Italy and France are a little less, and that's because France has a well-developed nuclear industry, and Italy has its great history with Libyan oil, which is some of the best in the world. Czech Republic imports 73%, Finland 76%, Lithuania 92%, Slovakia 98%, Hungary, it just continues and continues on up. Greece 40%, Sweden 46%. But you know, the Europeans are not the only ones dependent on Russian oil. The Russians are too. So energy exports for Moscow comprise a full 70% of Russia's annual exports. And that's 52%. That the monies associated with that are 52% of the entire Russian federal budget. But Russian energy accounts for 84% of all Russian oil exports, and those go to the EU. So the EU is the largest consumer of Russian energy. Okay, so we look at this, and then we consider Iranian actions in context around the Mediterranean. If those who haven't been noticing, the Iranians last year opened a naval base near Latakia on the Syrian shoreline of the Mediterranean. And that's right next to, by the way, the new Russian air base at Latakia, which went in 2016, at the same time that the Russians installed S-400 missiles in Latakia. They ranged 250 miles out into the Mediterranean. That is an A2AD, anti-access area denial bubble. That's the third of 3 such A2ADs on the NATO perimeter. That means something strategically. It constrains our freedom of maneuver in the Mediterranean. It protects Russian and now Iranian vessels operating there. The Iranians have also been trying to establish another naval base where? In Yemen. And now that we've delisted the Houthis and we've pulled US combat power out of the area, I see no challenge, no obstacle to the Iranians being able to establish that naval base. And that would be right at the Shatt al-Arab. So what does that mean? At the south end of the Red Sea, we've got an Iranian naval base. At the north end, above the Suez Canal on the Syrian shoreline, we'll have another one bolstered with Russian naval assets. For those who don't know, 19% of the world's daily production of oil flows through the Red Sea en route to Central Europe. Where is another Iranian naval base? The largest one sits on the Straits of Hormuz. So that was through the straits there flows a third of the daily production, global production of petroleum. We can continue to ignore this chess game played by Tehran and its Russian ally. And then we'll be looking back someday and wondering how the heck did this happen? By then it'll be too late. And this is the game that Tehran plays, and they learned this from Moscow. Moscow did this in Georgia. Tehran has done this in Lebanon. They're continuing to do it in Syria and elsewhere. And it's basically this. They realize that by way of their operations just short of triggering decisive U.S. activity in response, at the point they are able to go overt, and they've consolidated their control in regions important to them, by the time they're able to go overt on it, at that point, the cost to the West of reversing that will be so seemingly high that there'll be little heart in the West to do anything about it. And that takes me to where I want to close, and that's the value of the objective. I talk about this all the time because I see it as supreme importance. It's the value of the objective that determines the magnitude and the duration of any war any nation will wage in its pursuit. And I assert that this applies to any large-scale human endeavor. If it's of low value, the objective, well, we can only wage a corresponding low-cost effort, or everything goes into disequilibrium. But if it's a high-value objective, we'll do just about anything, and we'll endure just about anything. And here's where the Biden administration does not give me great confidence. I do not believe, based on the history of the key actors in this administration, I do not believe they are willing to articulate the great stakes we have in reestablishing a favorable balance of power vis-a-vis Iran in the Persian Gulf. I do not believe they will articulate the great value in preventing a nuclear Iran from emerging. And I do not believe they will articulate a great value in securing assured access to energy over time. I just don't see this happening. And just the opposite. This is an administration with key players who are personally involved in trying to appease the Iranians with $150 billion in cash. And as far as I know, they're up to it again in other ways. So I'll leave it there and certainly open to questions later, but thanks.
Thank you, General Adino. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask Matt Brodsky a question, and then we'll open it to questions if either of you have for each other. Otherwise, we'll open it to questions from our audience. If you do have a question, I ask that you raise your digital hand, and if you don't know how to do that, then just wave or jump up and down, and we'll find you. General, you and I have spent a lot of time over the years talking about energy issues, oil in particular, and so on. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on the Biden energy policy here at home, and how that may impact our relationship as you've been talking about energy issues. The other comment that I wanted to make, which I think is relevant here, and certainly both of you can comment on this as well. And then now that I ask both my questions, I'll send it back to you. And that is, I don't know if you noticed this yesterday, there was a report that 30 Democrats have requested that the president give over his sole control of the nuclear codes. So therefore, God forbid, if it's ever needed, now we have to wake up a committee to whether we can respond to something that's happening overseas. I'm not a big fan necessarily of this president and his policies along these lines, but I think it's a huge mistake to take that authority away from the commander in chief. But anyway, so I think that all of that plays into some of your comments that you made. But I'm eager to hear your thoughts, General.
Well, I mean, on the nuclear piece, yeah, I mean, leadership by committee is no leadership at all. Not only does it lead to promote delays and just unresponsiveness, but it also worse still, it hides the blame. How's that? No one has their, as George C. Scott said in Dr. Strangelove, no one puts their essential juices on the line. Okay, you've got a committee and they can diffuse the blame. And so I actually think if you're going to try to put nuclear decisions into a committee, I mean the final decision on nuclear force into a committee's hands, that can also promote a very dangerous recklessness. where no one is really held responsible personally. That would be a ridiculous thing for us to do. All right, so on the energy issues, yeah, I mean, I like to say that acting in one's self-interest is the essence of rational behavior. A lot of people, break out in hives when you say stuff like that, but it's the truth. It's history, right? And yet we are taking these strange, weird actions that are ceding our U.S. Advantage in energy reserves. What the heck are we doing? I don't understand why we're doing this. And we're losing American jobs in the process. And you know who gains? You know what happens when the US shuts down a pipeline to Canada? The Canadians don't need less oil. They still need the same energy. There are other energy markets that they can get that oil from, and they're across the Pacific, quite likely. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to tell you.
Does this just ultimately open up markets for Iran?
Yeah, I mean, Iran, instability is Tehran's one of Tehran's objectives. Instability vis-a-vis an energy market, because what does that do to the energy prices? It ratchets them up. Iran right now is struggling economically for various reasons, and one is low energy prices. Moscow too. I mean, Moscow, as I said, 52% of its federal budget comes from the export of energy. So it too needs to promote instability in order to increase global prices for oil.
No, thank you. It's Matt Brodsky. I listened with great interest to your comments. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are with regards to the Abraham Accords and its relationship to our negotiations or to the activities with Iran. Does it help? Does it hurt? Or does it have no impact whatsoever, but rather will ultimately have impact on our relationship with the participants of these accords or members of these accords?
I would file that question under the what a difference an administration makes, right? Because the answer depends on where you stand on the topic. And I should point out that within just an hour before we convened this meeting, there was breaking news from I-24, an Israeli network, that was saying that Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain are making a defensive pact. Let me find the exact words that it said. I'm sure more information on this will be coming out. In the midst of negotiating a four-nation defense alliance. So that is certainly a big deal. Now, that would, of course, been part of the goal of the Trump administration, and one of the purposes of having the Abraham Accord. Of course, under the Trump administration, there wouldn't really be the leak out of this information like this in this manner, because the United States would want to take ownership of it. I mean, not ownership in the sense of like being too bogged down in the details, because they understand that Israel and the UAE, for instance, and our other allies there, are incredibly capable themselves. But now you fast forward to today, and you have the announcement really is designed to put the brakes on the Biden administration's approach, which again, they perceive it in the way that I just explained, which is to say, it's not an Iran policy or an Iran containment policy even, it's a strategic realignment policy that we're seeing the reemergence of. And so this is why they're banding together. Right. To make this information public is to, again, draw the distinction that these countries were all kept in the dark during the JCPOA negotiations from 2013 till 2015. Now it's in you know, it's in the public. They know about it. They can't be ignored. This is to say, we won't be ignored. This also reminds me of questions that I've been asked previously about what a Biden administration, if they would put a chill effect on the you know, the Abraham Accords countries and that type of normalization agreements.
אין לא הבאנו צ'ארג'ר, אבל אני לא מוצאת פה צ'ארג'ר. אני אשאל את אדו שהיא תבוא, היא צריכה להגיע.
Well,
Lo Hivanti. However, what I would say is that it doesn't matter because these type of, it was, I should put it this way. It was the fear of Iran and its growth of its power and its entrenchment enterprise throughout the region, which was one of the main factors that had the thaw in Israeli and Arab relations. And there were many, many other factors that I won't get into here. But the fact is, the more these countries are going to see the Biden administration attempt this rapprochement with Iran for no purpose, really, just the fantasy that the nuclear deal works, that they still harbor, the more they're going to grow together, whether it's public or not. Now, the one thing I make that's most interesting, if the news that I just discussed with Saudi Arabia being involved, the one part that's interesting there is that Saudi Arabia was listed because they're not a part of the Abraham Accords. This was a very big goal for the Trump administration peace team. They actually felt that they were fairly close to achieving that. In the end, it didn't happen. And now you see a bunch of moves by the Biden administration when it comes to Saudi Arabia, that it's, you know, putting into play its anti-Saudi stance, which is, I'm sure, making them less cautious about being involved in a coalition that is actually strong and can push back against Iran, because I fear as an American, we're getting back into an area when we see Iranian aggression in the region and elsewhere, we can no longer rely on our own government to push back, or frankly, to even, you know, be honest with us. Just as one example, just I think it was yesterday, Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, again said that the JCPOA permanently and verifiably blocked all Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon. You have to be insane to maintain that, okay? I mean, even the permanent aspect, which is obviously not permanent, the restrictions are, sunset clauses are done in 2030, but even the verifiably, like this happened on the day the IAEA came out with a report that said that there are, I think, 3 undeclared nuclear sites with highly enriched uranium that it's trying to look into, which is to say, if Iran were following to the letter, which it never has, the JCPOA, these sites wouldn't even be something that would have access, that the IAEA would have access to. So They keep promoting the same lie, and that's where we are.
Ernie, you have a thought on that, and then we'll move to Yoram Kinberg.
Just real quick. No, I mean, I agree with Matt, and here's where most Americans have been fooled by the JCPOA. You know, when they hear something like, you know, like rock bottom, oh, well, it provides for regular inspections of nuclear facilities. No, that's true, regular inspections. That's not all inspections. What's not listed there? Irregular inspections, i.e. those that are not announced, or those are at locations that are not previously screened. So the ability for us, for the West, to have a legitimate no-notice inspection does not exist, period, under the JCPOA. That's, you know, that's the only way you're going to promote honesty and honest disclosure. But, you know, most Americans just don't appreciate that fact.
Yeah, I would add with regards to the Abraham Accords, Matt, that it would appear to me that the Biden administration may be taking the Abraham Accords to levels that the Trump administration might not have expected ever achieving. So kudos to the Bidens for getting Saudi Arabia to formally participate in the Abraham Accords, where before they may have only wanted to stay in the background. Yoram Kinberg.
Thank you so much. Question is as follows. A, we'll have an agreement, better or worse, with terror or not included, and B, we don't. Let's say that the Iran, I take as given they'll try to cheat, because cheating the non-fidels, the non-believers, is part of their dogma. So we reach a point that Israel would have intelligence that Iran is very close to a point of no return. And they would say, we like to strike. In 2008 and 2012, before Bush Jr. and before the second Obama, Israel seriously, according to what I heard, considered an attack. And Bush sent Cheney to say, no way, I'm going to support you. And similar messages got to Israel from the Obama administration. Let's say, God forbid, we are now at 2023 or something like that, and we are very close, or Israel concludes, and share intelligence with the US that if we don't do it now, we'll have to live with Iran nuclear and all the ramifications to the region. Do you see that Biden would, at least as part of the deal with Netanyahu or his successor, would make a real commitment? It wouldn't happen under my watch, versus we'll consider all options when it comes to them, which is basically a no promise promise.
Matt?
Take a stab at that. Look, and those are very good points you bring up. That's what the Israelis at the time, I think it was Ehud Barak was defense minister in 2012, I believe, was discussing. The term they were using is Iran entering the zone of immunity, basically the point at which they would not be able to, where the Israeli Air Force or their means would be unable to accomplish the mission that they wanted to do without a incredibly high mass casualty type of event. Look, what we're seeing, first of all, I don't think that the Biden administration will give Israel that form of commitment. Look, they may say that publicly, but but Obama said that stuff publicly too. And again, personnel is policy. It's the same personnel who are running the show under the Biden administration. So this is not, that type of assurance is going to be meaningless in the same way the whole we're not having negotiations with Iran that are back channel in 2011 through 2013 were meaningless because Israel's Mossad was picking up intelligence through Oman that these type of negotiations were in fact happening. So what we hear publicly and what's happening privately are two different things. Unfortunately, what I think you're seeing is a replay of the previous textbook, and how I think that will unfold in the coming months is we're looking for the pretext to get back into the nuclear agreement. And again, as I just explained, we're still selling the same fiction that it's permanent and verifiable, okay? So we're already starting with not telling the truth to the American people publicly, and the media who's supposed to be keeping them in check at these press conferences. But in 2013, we also saw the whole idea, the reason that we were in the negotiations, if you recall, was because, quote, a window of opportunity existed. And that window of opportunity was presented by the, quote, moderate election of Hassan Rouhani as president. Unfortunately, the people who work for Obama have really big mouths, and afterward, in the past several years, they came forward to say that, yeah, the whole moderate thing, that was just a pretext we used. That we don't actually believe that kind of stuff. But that doesn't matter. We're going to forget about all of that. The elections are coming in Iran in June. We'll probably try to use that as a pretext to get back into the nuclear agreement. And once again, it was all of our leverage that we gave up to begin with before getting into the nuclear negotiations. What Iran is demanding currently is that we part with our leverage again by releasing sanctions. The one thing we can do is try to keep these sanctions in place, because the Trump administration used a lot of the sanction mechanisms to be on ballistic missiles, human rights issues, and on terrorism, all of which have nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, which was by design, according to the Obama administration. But therefore, there's no reason that those sanctions should be listed. But look, Israel is going to have to be, in the end, it's going to be a decision for them to have to make. I would just close my comments by saying this. We're in a better place, even though the breakout time is closer now, today, than we were earlier, because if you recall, I think around the time in 2012, when we're talking the zone of immunity, the corollary debate was, does Israel have the capability to reach Iran from Israel? Are there secret air bases in Azerbaijan? Can they launch from there? And when you have a open defense pact, perhaps, but at least if not the Abrams Accord countries, it's just a little puddle jump from the UAE. And again, that's just if you're talking air. There's all sorts of other types of attacks, cyber warfare, scientists that have bad things happen.
Thank you. Ernie.
Yeah, sure. So I'm continually mystified by Joe Biden's eagerness to attempt to negotiate from positions of weakness. I don't know in what universe that makes sense, but apparently it does within the Beltway these days. You know, we lost our opportunity by which to negotiate a legitimate, effective agreement with, or potentially effective agreement with Tehran. And that was, the last opportunity was in 2009. And what was the situation? What was the strategic situation vis-a-vis Tehran? They had nearly 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. They had, I don't know, 75,000 troops in Iraq. So Iran was essentially surrounded by U.S. combat power. They had combat power on both sides of the country. They had sanctions that were in place, and the economy was struggling. And they also had their last real violent student protests, and that was in 2009. And I recall very well that the administration was in a position to help, the Obama administration was in a position to help reestablish the social media networks that the demonstrators were, the protesters were using to coordinate their activity. And we didn't do it. And we didn't do it. You know, in the previous student uprisings, and most Americans just don't know that these have been going all the way back to at least the early 2000s, when we've got a young demographic in Iran. It's overwhelmingly a young population in Iran. And the vast majority of Iranians have grown up knowing only life under the Ayatollahs. And they know they're going to school and they're getting well educated and they're graduating into nothing. No jobs, no future, no real potential for growth. And they're realizing that the promises of the Ayatollahs were hollow. And so these violent uprisings have been occurring and have been spreading. 2009 was a big one. So anyway, the combined effects of that, the sanctions, and the U.S. Combat power on both sides of Iran, if ever there was a time to negotiate a deal. It was then. Iran wanted nothing more than to get the American troops out of the area. And what did the Obama administration do? They pulled them out, it reduced the sanctions, and it started paying them money. What the heck is that? Okay. And then we start asking for a deal. On what planet does that make sense?
Absolutely. So we have time for two questions. We'll John Wallstetter and then Robin Gritz. John, please unmute yourself.
I'll make a few very quick comments on things that you can pick and choose. One thing is, it's not the Biden administration; it's Obama's third term. Obama is Angela Lansbury. Biden is Johnny Iceland, and Susan Rice is the Henry Silva character who was monitoring them. Biden, I don't even know if Biden knows what he's signing. But that also tees up, I think it's likely that he is going to be pushed out if he doesn't go voluntarily. They've got his family on the hook to get him out, because they're going to need two people campaigning for the off-year election starting in January. And that means that Kamala Harris will have to be able to step in. And she's going to be even worse news than Biden. Biden is just a fool. She is going to be even worse. Secondly, I noted Bibi's comment the other day about, oh, by the way, as to Matt, when he said about the moderates, Bob Dole had it right back at Iran-Contra time when he said an Iranian moderate is a radical who's run out of ammunition. But on the nuclear thing, Bibi was open and came out and said, basically, if you don't stop this, we're going to do so. And Israel is much more capable than they were 10 years ago of doing things, and partly for what Ernie said, they now have basing rights that they will guarantee they'll be taking off on puddle jumping things. But Israel can do that, and I also saw in terms of Hezbollah that they now can launch, they had an exercise, they can do 3,000 air sorties a day versus 100 back in 2006. This stuff is going on, and more of it in a way. And the next positive development we may need, silver lining and dark cloud, is when Hamas wins the parliamentary elections in May, which they will win. And I'm guessing that the polls are even understating by what margin they win. That'll make it almost impossible for Biden to pressure Israel, because no Israeli prime minister could last 24 hours if they get a negotiation with Hamas. But what we've seen right now is they already know they're not going to get anything out of this administration. The mistake in 2009, of course, was not helping the students, because they caught the regime off balance. And they really, as Krauthammer said at the time, I remember, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and they blew that. There is no possibility of getting a verifiable nuclear agreement. All you'd have to do is read The Greatest Threat by Richard Butler about the experience in Iraq, which showed how impossible it is to get in there. They're running out the back door with things. And a lot of the, how do you verify cruise missiles and things like that? There is no possibility of getting that. They will cave in on everything. But that leaves one other X factor I want to throw in. Perhaps there's an opportunity, particularly if Kamala comes in, they may push Israel, if she's foolish enough, to the brink of breaking diplomatic relations. So they won't do it openly, but that far apart, at that point, I see it's possible that the Israelis will turn to the Russians. They have a lot they can offer the Russians that they couldn't offer even 10 years ago. Russia needs the energy situation, but environmental, technological. They're not going to do military cooperation with them, and they won't violate our accords. But to make an opening to Russia to say, maybe you'd be better off having us than having, because Russia is not chummy with Iran historically. And it might be a decent trade for the Russians. They've never been eager to see nuclear proliferation in places where they can't control it. And they certainly can't control the Iranians. And that's a possibility, I think, that will open up, that there'd be another, because they are not going to sit back and let this, the Obama 3 administration, destroy all they've worked for. And the last one other point, America, if I were the Israelis, I would not want America to join in on the first day of a strike. I would call them after we struck and say, you want to help with the rest of it? Because I don't believe Deep State would keep that as a secret for 5 minutes. They leaked all the way back in the Obama years that Azerbaijan was a contingency base at that time for the Israelis if they flew in, and they leaked that to try and scotch that. So, and of course, back in 2007, that finding that Iran nuclear program was not going on was designed also to head off the strike. So I don't think they'll tell us. And at this point, Israel has to treat the United States as sort of a Bismarckian alliance here and there, and not regarded as the true friend it was under Trump, who was the best friend they ever had.
Thank you, John. You make some very good points. Ernie, did you want to respond to that briefly?
No, thank you. We're running out of time. I'm going to have to pop some.
Okay, so let's take our last question. As I said before, we had time for one more question. Robin Gritz.
How are you? I have a personal thing to ask because I worked on the hostage and personnel recovery working group with the national security staff under both Bush and under Obama. And in dealing with them, dealing with those administrations, especially the Obama administration, it was, we had useless obstacles called Susan Rice, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton put in our way, trying to bring anyone back from Iran. Specifically, I, of course, bring up Robert Levinson. We were in negotiations to get Robert Levinson back. Hillary Clinton messed that up in 2010, but also at the time of the Iran deal. And I want to note that, you know, he was not brought back during the Iran deal. And the family is seeking compensation from the government of Iran. So I would say in this, if they go into a deal, they need to compensate the family of Robert Levinson. But I do want to bring up something that Americans do not realize is there's a lot of dual citizen Americans, proud patriots that get taken into custody in Iran. And under the Obama administration, it was like pulling teeth to try and get any assistance in getting these people home. One example I'd say is Roxana Saberi. She was Miss North Dakota. We basically had to try and get her back by using methods that went around the official way of getting her back because we were getting such opposition from the State Department under John Kerry. Susan Rice was just useless. She didn't want to do her job. Another thing I want to point out to everyone, and a lot of Americans don't know this, is that in the Iran deal, that money that was sent over there was sent in different currencies. So when we see these rocket attacks taking place or attacks in other countries, we funded that. So a lot of Americans don't realize it wasn't just U.S. money that went over. It was easy for Iran to take that cash that came over and send it to their subsidiaries in those respective countries that use that currency. So I have a real problem with that. But I agree that it is Obama's third term. I worry about what that means for the American people when we travel overseas and put our lives in danger. Because we have a government now, an administration that, if they go along with what Obama administration was not very friendly to bringing these individuals home from any kind of grasp that the Iranian government had on them. So I ask you, like, what can someone do, like the Levinson family, to speak out on this and to try and stop the government, the administration, from going back into a deal?
Matt, do you want to take that?
I would just say that what they can do is essentially exactly what you just said. Say that. They need to say that loudly, and places need to have that covered. I mean, you bring up a very good point, which is I think that would be most accessible to at least Americans, is the idea that not only did we cave in 2015 to last minute unbelievable demands from Iran in order to seal the deal, but we had like less than zero of our own. We could not even get hostages back. In fact, Iran took more, I believe, the month following, and all the while John Kerry.
Yes, they did. They took more.
Right, exactly. So we need to make that the case. The one thing standing in the way of a more effective U.S. policies, this is all laying down markers, which I think all of us are trying to do, to say, here's what an agreement would look like that would be okay, or have you done this first, or don't return those sanctions. That this type of getting our hostages back is extremely important. The other thing is, we're not in a good place politically at home for a lot of reasons on both the left and right. But one of the issues, generally speaking, I would say, is the idea that the U.S. should just withdraw troops from the regions entirely. The entire concept of endless wars, which is nonsense because our enemies actually have a vote in it. I see our military as a very important arm of our diplomatic strategy. Its presence is very important in creating leverage, and that's without actually having to use them. And that is something that I think would be very important. We undermine everything, including what you're saying as an idea, if we grant up front what what was previously said, our withdrawal, at a time when that was really what Iran wanted in around 2009. Okay, well, if we're just giving that up front, that's a giant concession. We shouldn't make those.
I think that I just to add one point, Robin, I think that we live in a time now where everybody has an interest in what's happening in politics, and I think that this has occurred certainly over the last 4 years, and possibly even maybe the last 8 to 12 years, where the average citizen has a greater interest in what is happening. And in fact, because of the dynamics of social media and elsewhere, the average citizen has a greater impact and greater influence, I believe, in policy, both domestic and foreign. It's times like these and situations like that you're referring to that can really get people to begin to understand what is at stake with regards to negotiations with Iran. Ernie or General Adino talks about this time after time in most every briefing that I've participated with him. Is what is our interest? Let's begin with what our interests are. And typically, when we talk, he'll list a list of five interests in various different regions, and that's important for people to understand. So Joe Citizen may not understand the nuances of an Iran deal or an Abraham Accord like Matt Brodsky does, or military engagement like General Adino does, but they do understand when they see when they see that the Obama administration allow Iran to take over a U.S. Navy vessel and have our personnel on their knees with their hands behind their heads. The average person understands that. The average person can understand what you're referring to with the Levinson situation. So I believe that this is an opportunity that you can use to engage people in the larger context. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I thank General Adino, I think Matt Brodsky, for participating today in today's discussion, and we're going to have many more of these over the next few months as these I'm going to call them negotiations, but I think that's using the term negotiation loosely. But we'll have more of these discussions as we follow the happenings in Iran and the region. I thank everybody for joining us.